Hello and welcome back to VFX with Natron. Today we're going to be talking about expressions. No, we're not talking about expressions like, hi, I'm here, hello, I'm really pissed off at you right now. You need to pay attention to this video. No, this is going to be expressions in Natron, talking about it's a type of programming to make things do things. You know, automatically, sort of, kind of. Let's get into it, okay? All right. So, we're here in Natron, and we've got a default, although it's offset a wee bit. And what we're going to do first is we need to add something that we can animate. We need to put something that we can use an expression on. I'm going to skip putting a background in here at first. We're going to just start with something simple. Let's just do a text node. All right. Oops. Text. And we'll tell our text node that we want to center interact, and we're going to change the text to something like hi, and we're going to disable our overlay so that we can just see it, and we're just going to pretend that that the overlays are there. All right. So to do an expression, let's also make our font a wee bit bigger. Let's make it like 200. There. So now, hello. It's being all friendly and everything. All right. We're going to add a transform node. And so I'm going to hit T to add a transform. And then to get to an expression, what we could do. All right, let's first talk about the way we've dealt with movement in the past has been we've keyframed everything. And keyframing is okay. It's a good way to do things. Except for it's a horrible way to do repetitive tasks. There are ways in Natron of taking keyframes and making them repeat, but and that's useful in certain circumstances, but a lot of times there's types of animations that one wants to do that that are simple movements or simple color changes and so forth that happen on specific frames and so forth. And that's where expressions can be useful. That's one of the places where they can be useful. They can also be useful for making things shake and shimmy and do all this other fun stuff. So we're going to start with... all right, so right now we have nothing much. It's just a hi. And if I grab the translation and I were to... translate it in the X. Let's mark this up to 10, so I'm moving, and I can move with my mouse up and down and make this move side to side. Yay, boring, not very exciting. Let's reset that to its default, and instead let's right click on this and go down to this lovely thing called set expression. And you'll notice there's two options here. There's set expressions. If you have two-dimensional values like scale or position or things like that, you can set an expression, create a single expression that applies to all variables in that. So in other words, for translation, we could make it so that there was something that affected both the horizontal and the vertical, or the X and the Y, simultaneously. But usually, unless you're trying to make something work on diagonals, you don't really want to do... don't want to affect them both simultaneously most of the time. Most of the time you want to deal with them on an individual axis. And for what we're going to do today, we're going to do a single axis and each axis individually. And it'll make sense when we get along, because we're going to do something fun But for right now, we're going to just start off with just making this high move. And that way we can make it move across the screen from one side to the other, and we'll make it loop. And it's actually quite easy. So we're going to hit set expression for the x being horizontal. All right, and it brings up this lovely dialog, and it starts off, there's two options in here. You have single line expressions, which is, if you can, I could literally just type in a number here. I could say, I want this to be at, let's put it at a decent amount, 200. If I tell it that I want this expression to result in a value of 200, this being an integer, aka a number, or it's either an integer or actually in this case it could be a floating point, but we're just entering an integer. And by the way, Natron automatically converts integers to floating point and floating point to integer for those who understand what that is. And for those who don't, integers are basically whole numbers, and floating points are numbers that have decimal points in them. So right now, because this is just a solid 200, that's an integer. We haven't put a decimal point. I could change it into a floating point by putting a dot zero at the end. It really doesn't matter. I hit OK, and there we go. We moved it 200. I don't know if you saw it. It jumped over 200 pixels. I'm going to clear the expression and reset it to 0, and we saw it move back. So let's set our expression again, or we could have edited our expression. Moving it 200, just setting the value isn't very useful. What's more useful is moving it in some way. Well, in order to move it, we need something to drive it. And the most obvious thing that we want to drive it for animation purposes is our frames, or frame increment. And lo and behold, the simplest form of movement is just simply typing in frame. And so now what this is going to do is, on every frame, it's going to move it that frame number over. So when I hit play, you can see it's moving the high over, and it's really moving very slowly, which isn't very useful. So this gets into our first thing, and you'll notice also when it gets to the end, it looped back to the first frame because it reset its position. Now our offset here, our center, let's stop this for a moment. We can see here that by default our text started at frame it's taken it a second. It hasn't updated. There we go. It just refreshed. Sometimes, by the way, I'm going to let you know, Natron with expressions can sometimes lag, and it's going to lag a little bit today due to live streaming at the same time. All right, so up here we have our translation, but we're starting off in the center of our view. And the reason that it's starting off at our center of our view is because the center of our view, this is our offset. It says here center X, center Y. And we told our text that it was going to be in the center of the screen. This is just the simplest way to get it into the center of the screen, and then use a transform. So if we offset our center, that wouldn't actually, if we offset this, it won't actually move, or it shouldn't move. Yes, it doesn't actually offset our position. What this is doing is it's offsetting the pivot for the translation. So I want to reset that. That's not the way you would do it. The way we would actually change it is we would move it in our actual translation to get it over to its initial position. So we're not gonna but I just want you to know we're center interacting. This is where the pivot point is. And all right, we're going to right click and show overlays. You can see that's what this little doodad is. And if I grab this doodad and I move it around, you'll notice that as I'm moving it around right now, because we have an expression set on the X, it's only moving vertically, no matter how far over to any one side I'm moving it. All right. That's because the expression is forcing it to stay at 1, because it's on frame 1. All right, we're going to reset this to default, all dimensions, and we're going to hide our overlays again. All right, So we'll go back to our expression, and I know I've reset it a second time. It wasn't very interesting. So how are we going to fix this? How do we get this? I want this to start on the far left-hand side of the screen and then move across the screen to the far right-hand side of the screen. And it's probably looking reversed to you. I don't know. Left to right. Anyway, so what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, I want this to, first of all, we want to do frame. Let's increase the amount it moves per frame. The way we do this is we multiply it by an increment value. Okay, so if we want this to move faster, we can put in, say, I want it to move 100 units per frame. So now what it's going to do is on frame 1, it's going to say 1 times 100 equals 100. So it's going to move it 100 pixels. Then on frame 2, it's going to be 2 times 100. So it's going to move it 200 pixels. And so on and so forth. This, of course, will lead to a problem we're going to see in a second here. So we're at frame 1, 1 times 100. You'll notice it already started off moving it over 100 pixels. But we hit play, and it was there for a second, and now the screen's blank, and we're waiting, and nothing's happening because it moved off the frame, and oh, it came back for just a second, and now it's gone into the never. Okay. First thing we need to do is I want to start it way off on the left-hand side and get it to go all the way to the right. So let's edit our expression. Go here. We're going to put this inside of a set of parentheses so that doesn't get affected anymore. Now, if you happen to know, the easiest way to get your subtract half of your frame width, if this is starting off at screen center, to subtract half of the screen width, all I have to do is take whatever my width is, which I happen to know is 1920, and I can divide it by 2. Okay, so what I'm doing is I'm getting half of the value, and then I am I'm subtracting it from it. Okay, so that will now, let's see what that looks like. Let's rewind it to the beginning and hit play. Now it's going across, and it may not look it, but show overlays again. Beginning, it starts off on the left-hand side of the screen, moves all the way to the right-hand side of the screen, and then goes off into the nether. All right, the next thing we want to do is obviously we don't want it to keep going off. We want it to, once it leaves the right-hand side of the screen, go back to the left-hand side of the screen and start again. All right, so whoops, oh, I got it. I actually think I may have hit the wrong thing. I just want to make sure I get the right thing because I might have said edit expression for all dimensions. Anyway, so what we're going to do is this has moved it back. Half of 1920 is 960, I think. Yes, 960. Which moves it back 960, and we're good to go. Anyway, you can, this way you can change this to whatever later on. Back here at our frame, what we want to do is then take our frame, okay, and we're going to say, we're going to multiply this by 100, and then we're going to use a thing called modulo, okay? Modulo in this is based off of Python, these expressions, or the expressions we're using. So we're going to use a percentage sign, which stands for modulo. And what modulo does is you can think of it as, what it means is we're going to get the remainder. All we care about is the remainder of whatever the math. It's division of whatever the unit is and give us the remainder only. So in our case, what we want to do is we want to say the screen width. We're going to say every time it gets to the screen width, which is 1920, so I'm going to say 1920, it's going to reset. It's only going to give us whatever the result is of our frame plus multiplied by 100 and then divided by 1920, the remainder of that. So it's going to start off with 1. It's It's going to go all the way up to 1920, and when it gets up to 1920, when it goes to 1921 is bigger than 1920, so that returns a value of 1 plus 1 frame. So it's going to set to 1, technically. Actually, when it gets to 1920, it's actually going to reset to 0. It's only on frame 1 that we're going to be starting. Anyway, let's see how this looks. It will make sense once we go. We hit play, and lo and behold, our animation is playing across the screen, and it keeps going repeatedly. Now, you say, oh, I don't quite understand that. Is there any way I can visually see this? Well, the answer is yes, actually. If we go over to our curves editor, one of the nice things about Expressions is it actually displays in our curve editor. And we can see, oh wow, it looks a little weird. This is actually happening. We're zooming in a lot. So I'm going to zoom out until we have vertically 1920. This shows us a value of 0 or of negative, let's see, it's negative 1,000 to positive 1,000. And this line here in the center is 0. But we have a ridiculous amount of frames going to the right and left. Even though we see these jaggedies. What we are going to do is hold down, if you hold down your control key, and then use your middle mouse scroll wheel, you can zoom in horizontally on your timeline or on your graph. And so we're going to keep zooming in until we get these values down. And it might be, I apologize, this is a little hard to see right now. We're at 5,000. And we're getting down, and we're getting down, and now we're getting down to the point that we're seeing each sweep. So it doesn't take very long for it to make it across the screen, but it's basically what it's doing is it's going up to 1920, and then it's dropping back to 0, and then it's going up to 1920, and then back to 0, and so on and so forth forever, okay? And that's sort of modulo did. We could think of it, an easier way of thinking of this is if we edit this expression, think of this as where do I want my loop to end? Well, I'll have my start. My start is set up by this. This is where I'm starting. Okay, actually my start is my initial position plus or minus whatever I offset it by. This is my offset over here, which is half of my frame width. I'm offsetting it negative half my frame width, which moves the offset to 0 because I started at the halfway point. So that's where I start. And then I'm moving all the way from 0, my offset 0, all the way up to 1920. And then I want to loop. So it goes 0 to 1920 and loops. So that gets us this great thing. This is good, and we have this lovely, and we could make this work in reverse by subtracting the values from something at the beginning. We could say, 1920 minus this. So if I go, I'm just trying to think. Actually, if we just take, now I'm not gonna get into that. We're not gonna do that right now. I don't want to give a headache, and I want to keep this short, and I want to keep track of my time. Because what we're going to do is we're going to actually take and get rid of our high, and we're going to replace this high with something a wee bit more interesting. We're going to put in a radial. Whoops. Radial. Not a gradient. A radial. And we'll cook up our radial, and we're going to set it so it's uniform, and then we're going to set it to a nice small size of 50. Okay, it's not super duper small, but it's not super duper big either. Okay, and then we're going to reset its. We're going to hit the center button to reset its center, and when we hit play, we can see that it goes across the screen in this lovely little, horizontal pattern. Well, we're going to do something with the transform now, which is we're going to start making this move up and down. we're going to sort with a sine wave. So on the y-axis of our transform, we're going to go here and we're going to edit the expression for this, or set the expression for this. And what we're going to do here is we're going to put in sine. Sine means sine wave, and for anybody who doesn't know what a sine wave is, a sine wave basically is this thing that goes up and down like a wave. It just goes up and down, okay? And what you do is you put sine and then you put some value in there to calculate your sine. Well, what we're going to use is our frame, okay? We're going to use our frame, and it's going to return a value. But as we can see, this value is very, very small. It's less than 1 pixel. It tells us the result of this is 0.6. Well, 0.6, we're not going to see very much up and down movement. So the first thing we need to do before we close this is we need to make this much bigger. So we're going to take the result of this and we're going to multiply it by a big number. We're going to make it times 200. That ought to give us, and we can see we're getting a value of 121. That we should be able to visually see. So now we hit OK. And let's return this to start, and we'll start it. And look at that. We've got a nice sine wave. We've got our little bouncing ball, so to speak. That's really cool. Hey, you know, do you remember that old show, The Outer Limits? Oh, I bet we could do, you know how it always started with that, like, funny sine wave thing? I bet we could make a sine wave just like that. Aye, but how do we do it? All right, let's think about this. Right now, this is going, you know, pretty fast, but it's not fast enough. We're gonna make this go significantly faster. In fact, we're gonna make it go. Let's edit our x expression. And let's change our speed. Remember, this first one is how fast it's going across the screen. We're going to make this the exact same as our screen. So every frame of our animation, this is going to go from one side of the screen to the other side of the screen. You say, why would we do that? We're not going to see anything, right? Or are we? Let's find out. Let's hit OK. And let's hit play, and you're right, nothing's happening, or at least nothing we're seeing is happening. We're actually having something very interesting happen. We can see that it's going up and down, but it does not look like it's going horizontal. That's because it's happening at faster than our frame. Well, one of the cool things we can do is we can add motion blur to this. So let's take our motion blur, and we're going to put a very, very small amount of motion blur to this, because the more motion blur we add to this, the more detailed this is going to be. But I don't want this to take forever. Now, if you render this out on your own, you can take as much time as you want and make this as big as you want. Although I'll tell you what, if you get this up into like the 50, 60, or 100, you're going to be waiting a long, long time for this. And you're also going to start seeing the return sweep of the dot as it returns, because that actually happens at a subframe interval as well. And that actually does show up in this because we don't have what's called blanking on. And that will get into something far more than this is going to cover. We're going to just make us a sine wave that we can see. All right, so how are we going to do this? We're going to set it to 0.1. And as soon as I change this to 0.1, the first thing you should have noticed is that, holy smokes, we've got a line, or at least a dotted pixel line. It might be too dark. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in a multiply. We'll multiply here, and we're going to take that multiply, and we're going to jack it up so this is nice and bright, so everybody can see it. There we go. We've got this dotted line going across the screen. But it doesn't look right. It's not going all the way across our screen. Let's show our overlays, and we can see it's not going all the way across here. And, well, I'm not going to... It's a little offset, but that's all right. We're not going to worry too much about the offset. It's going across the screen halfway. Why? Well, that has to do with our shutter angle. Now, I've said before, we're having this go from one side of the screen all the way to the other side of the screen. And it's happening every frame, which means that there's a whole lot of sub-pixel information there, or sub-frame information there, but we're not seeing it. Now, how do we see it? Well, we're only seeing half of it because we're telling it the shutter angle is only 0.5. And this is a great way to view exactly what shutter angle does. The lower I reduce this, if I reduce this further, you can see that I reduce this down, and the shutter slowly shrinks, and our line shrinks towards the left because the shutter is only open for a shorter period of time. But what we want to do is tell it that for every frame of our animation, we want the shutter to be open the entire length of it. That way we can see this sweep go across our screen every frame. Now, in theory, we could actually do this multiple times, and that will create actually overlapping things if we don't have the interval. In fact, here, let's actually set it to, well, let's first set it to 1. All right, so I hit 1 on the shutter angle, and I hit return, and now you can see we have our sine wave is going across the screen, but we have a problem. It doesn't look like our sine wave. It looks like this long, thin thing. It's not very useful. And the reason that it's not very useful is that we actually have to make our vertical movement happen. There's a frequency that we have to put in there. We have to edit that. That's under Y. So the Y, that's our up-down. We have to make that up-down happen faster so that it will show up as this goes across, okay? So I'm going to edit my up-down, which is Y. I'm going to edit that expression. And here, for the frame, what I'm going to do is make it, just like before when we increased the frame or added something to increase it, here what we're going to do is instead of using frame, we're going to multiply the frame and make it so that that happens, that it jumps a greater distance in frames so that it gets a sample further down. So we're going to put in, we don't have to increase this much. We'll put it, we're going to put it at 50. That ought to give us a nice result. All right, let's take a look at what that does. And there we go. We now have a sine wave on our screen. All right. Hey, that looks a lot like that old program. Does it actually animate? Well, let's see. Hey, look at that. It's going across the screen. And you guys might notice every now and then there's these little bitty pixels that randomly seem to show up around it. That is actually bits of the dot going back across the screen very, very, very fast. We're not going to worry about that, or at least that's what I believe it to be. I'm not 100% sure, but it explains why there's an artifact. If you increase if you actually were to increase the speed of this, what you would notice is that every time as this goes up and down, and these don't line up from one side to the other. So what happens is it sweeps back, and then it goes, and it sweeps back and goes. We're not going to worry about that. Anyway, all right. So we've got this sweeping, and actually, we are almost done. I'm going to let it continue until we get it done. That way we can see it and watch our animation. There we go. We've got an outer limits sine wave going across. And if we go over to the curve editor and we look at our Y curve and we shrink it down, there we go, and then spin it out, holding down the control. Whoops, we're getting there. We can start to see, we got to get way in there. Where'd it go? I lost track of my, oh, I'm way off. Minus 200, there we go. All right, so here's 0, it's right there. All right, let's zoom in, and here we go. We can see our sine wave, and it looks very similar to our sine wave here. Of course, we got lucky. It just happens that I zoomed in at the right ratio to get it to look sort of like what we have up here. But you can see our graph here. But the cool part about this is that we've got a sine wave that matches our thing, and we can use this in our actual animations. So what we could do is take the output of this and we could put it in some special graphic, and then we would have an animation. So yeah, I don't want to go much further than this. This is just supposed to be an introduction to the concept of using this and a cool little thing that you can do. So there we go. If people have any questions, feel free to ask online. I'll stick around. Maybe I'm gonna actually keep the stream running. We're actually at the 30-minute mark at this point. So I'm going to let this run in the background whilst I take and answer some questions. If anybody has any questions, post away. You guys don't have any questions. Nobody has any questions. Raise your hand. You know what? We're going to call this. I think we're good to go. So, right. That's going to call it. You guys have a great Natron day and keep on Natroning.